This paper is actually an evolution of my THM paper. Now, the original title is the one that's actually listed. I kind of evolved the title as, this thing has evolved throughout the years, and I studied it and, gotten a lot more information and a lot more critique. So hopefully, you will enjoy as much as I enjoy writing this bad boy. So since it's highly technical, I'm sharing the screen so y'all can follow along. Hopefully it'll help in comprehending, but this is some very abstract ideas. So if you feel lost, it's okay. I'll probably get lost while I'm reading too. It's all right. So with that said, without further ado, let me get started. So clarifying ontological dependence within divine conceptualism. At the intersection of metaphysics and theology, a discussion has arisen regarding the existence of abstract objects, AOs for short, and their relationship to God, particularly the Christian God. Briefly summarized, Paul Gould argues that an inconsistency exists between two beliefs within a theistic system. The aseity of God, Gould labels the claim as the aseity sovereign doctrine, AD for short, within this work, and the existence of uncaused, necessary, and independent objects. In short, Gould clarifies this issue into what he labels an inconsistent triad. Premise 1, abstract objects exist. Premise 2, if abstract objects exist, then they are dependent on God. Premise 3, if abstract objects exist, then they are independent of God. It's a contradiction here. Many individuals assert that a reason to hold to the existence of AOs derives from a type of argument that upholds the existence of AOs, that the existence of AOs seems ontologically useful in solving particular philosophical issues or describing certain elements of reality. However, as illustrated by Gould, an inconsistency exists between the two beliefs of abstract objects and the aseity sovereign doctrine, AD. Therefore, in order to solve this issue, individuals must either reject or modify one of the three premises. Gould states that one can find a potential solution by rejecting premise 3 and by appealing to a conceptualist model. Divine Conceptualism, DC for short, provides a potential model for the solution of this problem. Although this model shows promise in solving the consistency between the beliefs in God's aseity and the existence of AOs, a potential problem arises as a result of adopting this position. J. Wesley Richards summarizes, nevertheless, the status of such abstractica, another word for abstract objects, takes on a theological urgency here. To avoid unsavory implications, what we should say is that God's perfect wisdom, goodness, and so forth is ontologically proud to these abstractions in order of ultimate explanation. In other words, if one incorporates a theory of abstract objects into a theistic system, assuming a preference for divine conceptualism, then one will have to consider the proper relationship that these AOs have in regard to God's nature. For example, as a result of improperly defining such a relation, one theistic system could face a bootstrapping inconsistency or challenge to the aseity sovereign doctrine. Therefore, the thesis of this paper will argue that although DC possesses the potential to provide a robust ontology consistent with the aseity sovereign doctrine, it first requires a sufficient explanation of the relationship between God's thoughts and his nature. This paper will explicate a view of a relationship that can undergird existing DC models by defining this relation as God's nature, grounding as a metaphysical explanation his thoughts. In order to argue this thesis of the paper, this paper will be divided into discussion into several sections. First, this paper will introduce and define DC in order to understand better the position and potential problems facing divine conceptualism. Furthermore, this section will clarify the problem that exists with divine conceptualism. Although divine conceptualism offers a convincing solution for the problems involving abstract objects and God's aseity, AD, DC possesses a potential problem in terms of a dependence relation between God's thoughts and his nature. For example, if one suggests that depositing AOs in God's mind in order for God's thoughts to serve the role of universals or exemplars, then one seems to predicate something, perhaps properties of attributes, about God that requires something prior to those thoughts. Therefore, in order to avoid a bootstrapping problem, one must clarify God's mental activity, how God's mental activity depends on God's nature asymmetrically. Second, the next section would offer a potential solution that posits God's nature as the grounds for God's mental activity. However, the notion of grounding seems vague. We're not talking about gardening, folks. Therefore, this terminology of this type of dependence or grounding requires an explanation and clarification. Richards, Thomas E. Tocco, and E. J. Lowe provides resources and categories in explaining this relationship. So let's dive into the paper. First section, problems with an improper dependence relation. As mentioned previously, Gould suggests that DC can serve as a potential solution to the inconsistency between AD and the existence of mind-independent AOs. In particular, this view provides individuals with a modified realist position that contributes a solution to many of the problems that Platonic realism poses for theism, while reaping many of the benefits of Platonic realism. Briefly defined, Stephen B. Cohen and James S. Spiegel assert that divine ideas or concepts could stand in for the AOs within a theistic model rather than mind-independent AOs. On this view, the divine ideas serve as universals, as they state, or exemplars that are exemplified by particular things outside of God's mind. Gould further clarifies this position by referencing our own Greg Welty at Southeastern, Theistic Conceptual Realism, TCR for short. AOs are those constituent entities of the divine mind that perform a certain function within the created order. For example, the concept of a universal is the concept of a thing that plays the ontological role of explaining attribute agreement and ground the truth of atomic sentences of the form A is F. The reason for this shift in divine thoughts derives from the goal to circumvent theoretically the challenges that exist with mind-independent AOs that challenges the existence of mind-independent AOs poses to the aseity sovereign doctrine. Other than the already mentioned AD, aseity sovereign doctrine, by positing that God officially causes the existence of mind-independent AOs, one has introduced a bootstrapping problem. Gould summarizes this worry. Typically, the worry is advanced as follows. God has properties. If God is the creator of all things, then God is the creator of his properties. But God cannot create properties unless he already has the property of being able to create properties. Thus, we are off at the races, ensnared in a vicious explanatory circle. Part of the appeal of DC originates by placing an asymmetrical dependence of AOs onto God, making AOs dependent on God, and fixing these AOs as purely conceptual within God's mind. However, one would have to assume that God's mind represents the type of mind that can act as an appropriate receptacle for these AOs. Indeed, one considers the implications of this type of being God represents. Then one would have good reason for believing that God's mind can act as the appropriate receptacle for these AOs. Greg Welty states in relation, first, a divine mind, being omniscient, can clearly have enough thoughts for all truth and possibilities we intuitively think there are. Second, if necessarily existent thoughts are required, they must be the thoughts of a necessarily existent mind. It doesn't require much further thought to see whose mind this must be. A necessarily existent mind must be the mind of a necessarily existent person. And this, as Aquinas would say, everyone understands as God. Third, and finally, objectivity is secured by there being just one omniscient and necessarily existent person whose thoughts are uniquely identified as these abstract objects. These thoughts would have extra mental existence just as on realism. At least they have it relative to finite minds. Although Welty argues for a particular type of divine thought to AO's equivalents, propositions in possible worlds, the point remains empathetic. A divine mind can fulfill the conditions of being the receptacle of the infinitely number abstractica. Although DC's model seems convincing, this position requires a further clarification of the relationship between these divine thoughts and God's nature in order to avoid another bootstrapping worry. One could rephrase this worry into the question, which is ontologically prior, in order of ultimate explanation, God's thoughts or his nature? Thomas V. Morris and Christopher Menzel, Absolute Creationism, AC for short, reflects an example of how one can improperly articulate the relationship between God's nature and his thoughts. Absolute creationism reflects, as William Lane Craig states, a sort of divine conceptualist model, because according to which objects usually taken to be abstract are really thoughts in God's mind. However, absolute creationism goes further than DC in that it argues that God creates AOs by his intellective activity. Nevertheless, Richard demonstrates two problems with this model, relating it to the dependence relation. Within Richard's first criticism, he criticizes the view that God's intellective activity poses ontological priority as a causal explanation. Can we affirm, as Richard quotes, that all abstract truths are still caused by God's eternal intellective activity? It seems not. There is clearly an important distinction between God as the preeminent active causal agent and the eternal objects of his thought, which do not call anything into existence. And we clearly want to maintain that God's ideas are not outside of him, that they illicitly dictate what he is and what he can do, or what they are independent of God's thinking them. In other words, God's thoughts do not possess any causal relation to anything outside of God. Instead, God is the preeminent active causal agent, or God stands in active causal relationship with creation. These divine mental activities do not cause anything to come into existence. Instead, as Welty points out, if God is a person, then he has beliefs, powers, and intentions. And if God is not only the creator of the universe, but he is an intelligent creator, then his creative acts consist of divine power actualizing divine intentions. This quote emphasizes that God, as an agent, has a causal relationship with the world, not his thoughts or mental activities alone. The agent, God, actualizes his own intentions. Logically following the last criticism, Richard believes that Morris and Mendel's proposal implies God's self-creation. Still, the bootstrapping problem rears its ugly head again, according to Richards. Since Morris and Mendel's proposal implies that God has necessarily and eternally caused his existence and essential properties to exist, not by the exercise of his free will as strong actualism, by his eternal thought. But this would entail, for example, that God is all-powerful just because from eternity, God has reflected on the fact that he is all-powerful. But clearly, for this to be possible, God would have to have the property in the first place, call it P1, of being able to think his omnipotence into existence. But perhaps one might retort, God also thought that property into existence from eternity. Okay, well, then he would have to have another property, P2, and off once again goes to infinite regress. So just explain this because it's a little bit complex. Take a second. He's saying that for God to think up the property of omnipotence, he first has to have a property called, let's call it, the property of thinking up omnipotence. Well, that property he had to create too. So maybe he has to have another property that's above that property, the property to create the property of creating omnipotence. And you see this kind of as an infinite regress. It just keeps on going backwards and there's no terminal stop. In other words, this bootstrapping problem derives from one improperly grounding God's nature or his essence in his mental activity. The possession of these types of divine thoughts seems to require a property or power of omniscience of God. Welty summarized well the existence of how the existence of divine ideas followed from God's omniscience. He states, one could argue that it is reasonable to hold that God's ideas, simply because God is omniscient, for if, as seems likely, at least part of that omniscience is exhausted divine self-knowledge, then knowing his own power, God would know which worlds or sets of concrete substances he could create. If this knowledge includes the belief as essential components, because knowledge is in general is justified true belief or your Plantinga fans out there, warranted true belief. And if belief presupposes the possession of concepts, then presumably divine omniscience entails the possession of a multitude, if not an infinite number, of concepts or ideas, and thus the existence of divine ideas follow from God as omniscient, as well as from God as intelligent creator. Therefore, Richard's criticism of Morris and Menzel's proposal seems to point out that Morris and Menzel, proverbially speaking, places the cart before the horse. In order to explain God's thinking something about his nature into existence, Morris and Menzel would have to presuppose the object of the discussion to which God thinks into existence. Furthermore, simply qualifying this proposal with the duration from eternity would not solve this problem. See Richard's quote above. Although perhaps one has eliminated a temporal chronological priority, saying that there's a temporal time chronological priority from eternity, the need for an ontological prior explanation remains within this. What is this? Okay, so example, therefore, sorry, I'm on my wife's computer. I don't know what that was. And therefore, the infinite regress remains. In short, at this issue's core, the problem seems to focus on a requirement for a proper grounding or ordering of some sort that clarifies this relationship. Moreover, as demonstrated above, this grounding cannot officially begin with God's thoughts. DC will follow the same route if the dependence relation starts with God's thoughts or intellective activity. In contrast, DC should differ from AC in several important key ways, but the chief difference should reject placing dependence fully on God's thoughts. Instead, as Alvin Plantinga states, but then God's thoughts stand in God in the relation in which a thought stands to the thinker. This is presumably a productive relation. The thinker produces his thoughts. It is therefore also a causal relation. However, another problem arises. By characterizing this dependence relation as productive or causal, one has introduced another problem into this model. This notion of a productive or causal relation introduced another contradictory notion of God's self-creation. To use the example of propositions, if God produced or created the proposition, God exists, conceptually, then God would have caused his own existence to exist in virtue of causing this proposition to exist. However, certainly the proposition God exists must exist before God calls this proposition to exist conceptually. Welty notes that even if God only creates propositions, the bootstrapping problem worries remain. If God causes the proposition God exists to exist, he causes essence, which includes the property of being true, to be exemplified. Thus, in causing this proposition to exist, he makes it true, and thus God causes his own existence. Therefore, a proponent of DC should reject a causal dependence between any of God's mental activity, thoughts included, and his nature and vice versa. One cannot underemphasize the importance of this rejection, for it could save DC from a bootstrapping problem in terms of the self-creation problem. Furthermore, AOs are typically thought to exist as internal and necessary things. The proposition God exists. I'm sure if God, the proposition God exists describes the state of affairs that God exists and God is necessary, you think that this proposition is necessary. Therefore, by introducing a productive causal relation to this model, it is not clear how God could produce something that has the feature of eternality and necessity. If it has the feature of existing always, how do you cause that to exist? However, simply rejecting a causal dependence is not enough. By reinterpreting these AOs as thoughts and depositing them in the mind of God, one seems to predicate something, perhaps properties or attributes about God that requires something explanatory prior to his mental activity or thoughts. For God to think, you would think that God would have to have the property of thinking. Although the bootstrapping problem of self-creation evaporates with the denial of causal dependence, the proponent of DC will need a better model that can clarify and order properly this dependence relation. Therefore, the next section will explore placing this grounding potentially in God's nature while rejecting a causal dependence. However, with this approach, terms like grounding or ontological and explanatory prior remains vague. What do we even mean by that? Although the above example provided by Richard seems to presuppose an asymmetrical dependence implicitly, other types of grounding still exist that could provide a more consistent and cogent picture of God's nature and thoughts. Richards, Teco, and Lowe offer insight into the potential solution within the subsequent section. Appropriate asymmetrical grounding. As mentioned above, advocates of DC argue that if AOs exist, then they exist in a dependence relation on God. The motivation for this type of relation derives from a type of desire, to satisfy the conditions of AD. However, as Gould points out, AOs are identified with various constituent entities of the divine mind and are uncaused yet dependent on God. Just how, this is key, just how this dependence relation is to be understood is an open question. Individuals such as Welty identify AOs with God's thoughts, and they define this dependence as constitutively dependent on God. I'm just going to prove that, just get out of the way. In such a way that these ideas can perform a certain function within the created order. As critical as this dependence relation requires definition and clarification, this dependence relation that these thoughts, which perform the role of AOs, have relative to God's nature requires an equal amount of attention. As mentioned above, improperly defined this relation can promote some problematic conclusions. Richards demonstrate this issue by arguing that Morris and Menzel improperly articulate this relation by defining the ordering from God's thoughts to his nature and defining them as a causal dependence, therefore leading to some problematic and bootstrapping conclusions. Richard believes a potential consistent model will reject the ontological priority that places God's thoughts as somehow prior to God's nature, and instead, such a model should place an ontological priority on God's nature. Richards hints at this solution in his writings. Nevertheless, the status of such abstractica takes on a theological urgency here. To avoid these unsavory implications, what we should say is that God's perfect wisdom, goodness, and so forth is ontologically prior to these abstractions in order of ultimate explanation. God, being or nature, precedes the discrete universal properties. Though universals eternally exist and are relatively distinct in the sense that God eternally abstracts them from reflecting on his own being, fulfilling conditions of DC. When we say that Socrates is wise, the claim is meaningful and true because of this prior act of God abstracting the concept of wisdom by reflecting on his concrete actuality of his own being, one aspect of which is perfect wisdom. In other words, Richards believes that in order to avoid unsavory implication, a consistent DC model must emphasize an asymmetrical ontological dependence that positions God's nature as, keyword here, ontologically prior in order of ultimate explanation to his thoughts. Therefore, in order of ultimate explanation, God's concrete actuality provides the basis for all AOs, God's thoughts. However, as attractive as this model sounds, simply reversing the dependence and labeling it as ontological provides little clarification to this dependence relation. This description seems vague at this point. In reference to the specific section on Richard's quote, he states that God's nature is ontological prior to these abstractions in order of ultimate explanation. God's being precedes these discrete properties in the sense that God eternally abstracts them, reflecting his own being. 2 points merit full clarification. First, already mentioned, the verb terminology ontological prior requires further clarification. Second, in addition to this vague terminology previously mentioned, God's action of abstraction of his nature seems to require further explanation. Furthermore, contingent on how one articulates the action of abstraction, perhaps one can decipher other areas of vagueness, such as shedding light on the terminology of ontological prior and contribute to his overall position. In regard to Richard's statement, he seems to assume two key points implicitly concerning God's action of abstraction. First, Richard appears to designate the term abstract with the epistemological category instead of a traditional ontological category. Just to skip ahead a little bit because we're running low on time, philosophers oftentimes make a distinction between what is ontologically abstract and epistemologically abstract. Epistemological abstract means that it is different as much as straightforward matter to think of baldness independent of Socrates. So you can separate baldness, if Socrates' baldness, from Socrates epistemologically. So when we talk about God abstracting from his nature. We're talking about God epistemologically abstracting, let's say, his perfect wisdom from his nature, grasping a full understanding of his nature. Second, God's nature seems to contain the concrete aspect capable of abstraction for God. However, the exact constitution of God's nature remains unclear. Whether it's something relating to ontological parts like attributes or something like powers, minimally speaking, something's capable of abstraction within God's nature seems evident in Richard's proposal. In fact, Richard believes that talk about God's nature should minimally incorporate essentialist language. Based on that notion, the proposal for this paper, one needs to not define the exact constitution of God's nature. As Richard points out, one can minimally view objects of abstraction of God's nature as facts or truths. So the point in this section to emphasize is that there's something within God's nature that God is grasping. So there's two aspects there. In order to clarify the relation of God's nature and his thoughts further, Tocco and Lowe offer insight in the philosophical terminology of ontological prior that Richard utilizes. Within his quote, in retrospect of Richard's quote, ontological prior to these abstractions in order of ultimate explanation, Richard seems to define this relation as a dependence relation. In other words, God's thoughts seems to depend on God's nature in order to explain some particular aspect of these thoughts. In addition, Richard characterizes these dependence, this dependence utilizing the phrase ontologically prior. In some sense, perhaps the phrase ontological dependence can accommodate Richard's purposes. Tocco and Lowe defines this term as a relation or more accurately, a family of relations between entities or beings. For these are the various ways in which one being may be said to depend upon one or more other beings, in the sense to depend that is distinctly metaphysical in character and that may be constructed with various other senses of the word. So since we're running low on time, I want to kind of skip ahead and kind of just get to the meat of what I'm trying to speak about, is that ontological explanation is still a vague term. So maybe the better term that we want to talk about starting right here is Richard seems to apply a particular function that explains the entity's existence in some fashion. This ontological dependence that emphasizes a deeper sense than a weak explanatory role. We don't want to say that maybe God's wisdom explains something about God's thoughts about wisdom, because that still provides kind of a liberal notion. We don't know what it explains about it. So maybe the better terminology is grounded in it as it relates to a metaphysical explanation, better clarifies this function of the ontological dependence. Grounding may be understood as a metaphysical explanation. To be more precise, when some X is grounded in some Y, it is usually thought that Y explains X. But even when we talk about grounded in this fashion, we're still using it as an explanatory role, still kind of vague under these terminology. So Welty offers insight in kind of talking about how we could actually talk about how God's nature grounds God's thoughts. That being that God's nature grounds God's thoughts explanatory role as that God's nature constitutively grounds God's thoughts. A good analogy of this is a lump of clay, how a lump of clay doesn't cause a bronze statue, but we can say that the bronze statue constitutively depends on the lump of clay. Although this analogy is limited, it kind of protects us from that causal problem that we were talking about earlier. And one major point that I want to pick out is this right here, is that ultimately, when we're talking about this, we're talking about asymmetrical dependence relation, that this flows from God's nature to his thoughts and not back and forth. So we're talking about fundamentality. But when we talk about that God's nature is more fundamental than his thoughts, we're not talking about it's more primitive. We're talking about a terminal explanation that at some point we have to terminate the explanation. So God's nature is more fundamental than his thoughts. So let me just finish up by reading this conclusion real quick. In conclusion, although this potential solution may be without its weaknesses, it represents a reasonable and consistent approach. DC can potentially bypass the challenge of AD while reaping the benefits of Platonism. However, a simple DC needs additional clarification in order to not succumb to the problems of other similar incarnations. If this relation is not clarified, potential bootstrappings can exist, centering on relationships of the thoughts of God and his nature in terms of ontological dependence. A position like TCR makes important modifications to see that informs the potential solution by rejecting a productive relation and affirming constitutive dependence. In its goal of solving this dilemma, however, in view of the ontological dependence discussion, perhaps the better term that captures the relationship between God and his thoughts is grounded. This notion has two aspects that describes the priority of God's being or nature to his thoughts: metaphysical explanation, constitutive dependence, and asymmetrical formality. This articulation of ontological dependence seems to be consistent with Richard's own explanation of the relationship between God's attributes and his thoughts. Thank you.